Mad Wild West podcast. These are the true stories that made it wild. Welcome to episode 8 of the Mad Wild West. Today we're going to venture into the deserts of Arizona, where battles between the American Calvary and the Apache Indians were fierce. Now, I know this is called the Mad Wild West podcast, and everybody thinks of just cowboys and, quote, Indians, but it really was a concerted war effort by the federal government who sent in the cavalry during about 1850s to about 1880s. And some of the most fierce battles happened in Arizona. And we're going to take a look at a couple of those firsthand accounts on this episode. They are hair-raising and thrilling, to say the least. Now, I will mention, a lot of times, of course, it's written as the Native Americans being the enemy, but we have to remember that they were just protecting their lands. They were here first, and they had been fighting the Spanish, and then the Mexicans, and then the Americans. So they really had to protect their lands, and that's what they were doing. And besides that, I think the Native Americans were the best caretakers of our lands. But on this episode today, we're going to see and get some insight into how the battles raged. And because these stories are a little bit longer, we're going to skip the headlines and the advertisements today and get right into the stories of the Mad Wild West battles. So this story is written by a cavalry soldier, an actual officer, who at one point had to take a trip in Arizona between two forts. And he went part of the way with another officer, and that officer split off from the trip. And the last part of his trip, he had to ride alone, and he had been very careful. And soon after him and his other officer buddy split ways is where this story picks up. An amazing story of a dash for life. And he writes, "My trip up had been unaccompanied by any event of interest, and I sincerely hoped that my journey down would be equally tame and spiritless. But this was not to be. I saved my noble beast all I could, frequently dismounting and leading him by the bridle, so as to retain his strength and speed in case of any necessity. In this way, we jogged on until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, by which time we had accomplished about 50 miles, leaving some 75 yet to go. The sun was intensely oppressive and glared like a shield of red-hot brass. A friendly bush surrounded by fine grass and standing about 100 yards to the left of the hard and splendid natural road which runs through 4/5 of the desert invited me to partake of its modest shade, and I turned my horse in that direction, but was surprised at noticing a column of dust to my left in the direction of the Serra Blanca, which had the appearance of being in violent motion and coming my way. Instinctively, I felt that it was caused by Apaches, and I took the precaution to tighten my horse's girths, see that the saddle was properly placed, and recapped my 4 6-shooters, 2 of which were in my belt and 2 in my holsters. I also untied a Mexican blanket, which was lashed to the after part of my saddle, and doubling it, I passed it over my shoulders and tied it under my chin by a stout buckskin thong. By this time, the character of the coming party was unmistakable, and they were evidently bent on cutting me off from the road. My gallant horse seemed to appreciate the condition of the affairs almost as well as I, and bounded on like a bird. The pursuing party failed in their first attempt and entered the road about 300 yards in my rear. Perceiving that my horse was infinitely superior in speed and power, I drew rein to save him all that I could, and allowed the Indians to come within 50 yards. There were some 40 of them, and none with firearms, but mainly supplied with lances. Only 5 or 6 of the number carried bows and arrows. These last named projectiles commenced to whistle near me, but I paid no heed, keeping steadily on my course until one penetrated my blanket. But the effect was completely destroyed by the fluttering of the heavy double folds, which were kept in a rattling motion by the speed at which we were going. Perceiving that the force of the arrow had been neutralized, I drew a heavy holster pistol, and wheeling half around in my saddle, I pointed it at the Indians. This caused them to fall back in some alarm, and I took advantage of that fact to redouble my speed for a mile or so, gaining some 600 yards on my pursuers, when I again drew rein to save my horse. It required a long time for them to again recover shooting distance, but their yells and cries were perpetual. In this manner, alternately checking and speeding my horse and presenting my pistol at the savages, we scoured over many miles of that desert landscape. Several arrows were sticking in my blanket. One had grazed my right arm, just bringing blood, and the other had touched my left thigh. I then became convinced that my horse was the main object of their pursuit. His value and unequal qualities were well known in the Apaches, and they were resolved to have him if possible. Of course, my life would have been sacrificed if they could only manage that little affair. I had bought the horse from Captain A. Buford, 1st United States Dragoons, who assured me that his equal did not exist in the territory. He had been offered 100 Mustangs for the horse by a Mescalero Apache, but refused, on the ground that he could take care of one animal with ease. But if he possessed 100, the Apaches would be likely to steal them at any moment while grazing. Near the foot of the mountain, the road takes a bold, sweeping curve to the left, being interrupted by a low but rugged series of small hills and deep ravines. About 8 o'clock p.m., the moon being bright and not a cloud visible, I dashed round the first hill, and I was surprised to note that the Apaches had apparently given up the chase, for I neither heard nor saw any more of them, although I was about 400 yards ahead. Suddenly it flashed upon my mind that they might have some sort of shortcut, and had pursued it with the intent of heading me off. For the first time, I struck my rowels into the reeking flanks of my poor steed, and most gallantly did he respond to the last call. He fairly flew over the road. Hill after hill was passed with wonderful rapidity until nearly a quarter of an hour had elapsed, when I again heard my Apache friends about 80 yards in my rear. No sooner did they perceive that their design had been penetrated and frustrated than they continued with their yells with additional vigor. But their horses were blown, as well as mine. They had come at their best pace the whole way, while mine had been saved from time to time. If I had come 50 miles at a slow pace in the early day, they had come 15 at dead speed before they reached to where our race began. In this manner, we continued our career until I arrived within 5 miles of Donna Ana. At about 11 o'clock p.m., when feeling myself relatively safe, I commenced emptying the cylinders of my heavy holster pistol among them. Their cries and yells were fearful at this time, but I did not cease firing until they had fallen back out of reach. The remainder of my journey was made without company, and I reached Donna Ana about 12 o'clock midnight, having made the distance of 125 miles on one horse in the space of 21 hours, the last 70 miles being performed at a run. Wow, that is amazing. Amazing that the horse can take that. And all those hours running for your life. That is insane. Back to the story here. Soon as I arrived, I threw off my blanket, which had quite a number of arrows sticking in it, called my friend Jose, and rubbed my horse down dry with good soft straw. This operation required about 2 hours. I then washed him all over with strong whiskey and water, and again rubbed him dry. This was followed by taking off his shoes and giving him about 2 quarts of whiskey and water to drink. His whole body and limbs were then swathed in blankets. A mess of cut hay, sprinkled with water and mixed with a couple pounds of raw steak cut into small pieces, was given him to eat, and a deep bed of clean dry straw prepared for him to sink into. These duties kept me up until 5 o'clock a.m., when I refreshed my inner man with a wholesome whiskey toddy, prepared by Buford, and sought repose from which I did not awaken for all that day and the succeeding night. On the second day after the above adventure, I visited my horse and found him in as fine condition as anyone could reasonably expect. He was neither foundered nor injured in any sensible manner. On many subsequent occasions he served me with equal zeal and capability, but never more under such exciting circumstances. Several efforts were afterwards made by the Apaches to get possession of that noble beast, but I am proud and happy to add, invariably without success. Oh, what a story. Talk about running for your life for hours. But that horse, what a amazing endurance story on both their parts. But one of the things I did get out of this story is how important whiskey was in the Mad Wild West. I guess that was the cure-all back then. Anyway, if you got a horse, it's an interesting way to take care of a horse. I didn't know they would eat meat. I didn't know they drink whiskey. I didn't know you can wash them in whiskey. And I guess then, after a rough day, you drink the whiskey. So there you go. A little chase by the Apaches in the Mad Wild West desert. All right, Mad Wild West fans, you asked for it. Here it is. Another battle. In consequence of the report made by Lieutenant Colonel E. Riggs, General, and General Carleton, again ordered me in the advance with Captain Thomas Roberts, Company E, 1st California Infantry. It became necessary to learn whether Dragoon Springs, some 28 miles further on, could supply both companies at that time with water, or whether we would be obligated to break into detachments. Captain Roberts took the advance with the infantry and 3 wagons, having also selected 7 of my best mounted men to serve as scouts and couriers. I remained behind with 15 of my cavalry and 10 of Roberts' company, including the detachment left as a garrison at the river, where a tolerable adobe building erected by the Overland Mail Stage Company afforded decent shelter and a defensible position. The night after Roberts left was one of the most stormy I had ever witnessed. The rain descended in floods. Earth and sky appeared thunder-riven. Blazing lightning leaped from the inky clouds and absorbed the darkness with their blinding flashes. The San Pedro roared and foamed. The animals quailed and bent before the storm, and all nature seemed to convulse. I was in charge of 16 wagons with their mules and precious freight, and my chief attention was elicited to their security and safety. Experience had taught me that the Apaches would select exactly such a time to make a bold attempt, and I doubled my sentries. Throwing myself on the earthen floor in front of a decent fire without removing my sidearms or any portion of my clothing, I endeavored to attain some repose. About 2:00 a.m., I was aroused by the sergeant of the guard, who informed me that strange lights were visible coming down the hill on the west, north, and south sides. A hasty survey showed me 4 lights, as of large burning brands, on 3 different sides of the compass, and apparently approaching the station. I felt convinced from this open demonstration that no attack was meditated, for in that case the great secrecy and caution would have been observed by the Apaches. Nevertheless, the garrison was summoned and disposed to the best advantage. All fires were extinguished and all lights shrouded from observation. In the course of a few minutes, 7 or 8 more lights made their appearance and seemed to be carried by persons walking at a rapid pace. Some of them approached within what I considered 200 yards of the station, and at one time I felt greatly inclined to try the effect of a chance shot from my rifle, but gave up the idea from the conviction that no Apache would carry a torch within that distance and maintain an erect position, while my fire might expose the persons of my men and draw a more effective return. After an hour and a half of anxious watch, the lights gradually united and faded away toward the east. It was not until more than a year had elapsed that I learned the meaning of this occurrence. A celebrating leading man of the Mescalero Apaches, named in English name Always Ready, gave the desired information which precisely tallied with succeeding events. He has said that the Apaches are a dispersed and perpetually wandering race. It is impossible for one detachment to know where others might be at any time, but that when a great body of them was needed for any joint undertaking, they made smoke signals of a certain character by day and signals by fire at night. That on the occasion of which I write, the nature of the country prohibited fire signals from being seen except from very short distances, and runners were hurried through the district bearing torches, which would indicate that the aid of all within sight was required. It was speed of the Apache. This explanation will account for what followed. Between 3 and 4 o'clock a.m., just after the lights had disappeared, the sound of horses advancing at a fast gallop was heard approaching the station. The sentinel challenged and was immediately answered with the round sexton response, "Friends." It was proved to be two of my own company, who had been sent back by Captain Roberts with the information that there was abundance of water at Dragoon Springs, and instructions to join him with the train without delay. The poor fellows had ridden 28 miles through that terrible storm, and in the heart of a country swarming with hostile and ever-vigilant Indians. 2 days subsequently, they had a splendid opportunity to test their gallantry, and most nobly did they respond to that appeal. In obedience to the order, we set forward before daylight to join Captain Roberts and reach Dragoon Springs without incident at 3 o'clock p.m. A long and fatiguing march of 40 miles had been made before reaching Apache Pass, where the next water was to be had, and as we were in doubt as to the quantity, it was again agreed that I should remain at Dragoon Springs until next morning, while Captain Roberts was to push ahead with his infantry and 7 of my company, leaving the train under my charge. At 8:30 p.m. he set out, and the strictest vigilance was maintained in camp the whole night. By daylight the next morning we were again in the saddle, and the train duly straightened out for the long and dreary march. Had we not been encumbered with wagons, my cavalry could have made the distance easily within 7 hours, but we were compelled to keep pace with those indispensable transports of food, ammunition, clothing, and medicine. A little before dark, we arrived at Ewell's Station, 15 miles west of the pass, and I determined to park the train as the mules had almost given out and were quite unable to accomplish the remainder of the march without some rest. Just as I had come to this conclusion, we perceived several riders coming toward us with all speed. They soon proved to be the detachment of my company with which had detailed to act with Captain Roberts. 2 of them were mounted behind 2 others, and all have evidently ridden hard. Sergeant Mitchell approached and saluting said, "Captain Roberts has been attacked in the Apache Pass by a very large body of Indians. We fought them for 6 hours and finally compelled them to run. Captain Roberts then directed us to come back through the pass and report to you with orders to park the train and take every precaution for safety. He will join you tonight." On leaving the pass, we were pursued by over 50 well-armed mounted Apaches, and we lost 3 horses, killed under us, and that one, pointing to a splendid gray, is mortally wounded. Sergeant Menard, now present, has his right arm fractured at the elbow with a rifle ball, and John Teal we believe to be killed, as we saw him cut off by a band of 15 or 20 Indians, while we were unable to render him any assistance. The wagons were ordered to be parked. Every man was supplied with ammunition and posted to the best advantage. Proper attention was paid to my wounded sergeant, and the camp arranged in such a manner as to ensure a warm reception to a large body of Indians. We remained on guard until 1 o'clock a.m. when, to my extreme surprise and sincere gratification, we were joined by John Teal, who was supposed to have been killed. He brought with him his saddle, blanket, saber, pistols, having lost his horse and spurs. His narrative is so full of interest and so will illustrate a phase in Apache character that it's worth recording. Soon after we left the pass, he said, we opened up a sort of hollow plain or vale, about a mile wide, across which we dashed with speed. I was about 200 yards in the rear, and presently a body of about 15 Indians got between me and my companions. I turned my horse head southward and coursed along a plain, lengthwise, in the hope of outrunning them, but my horse had been too sorely tested and could not get away. They came up and commenced firing, one ball passing through the body of my horse just forward of his hindquarters. It was then about dark, and I immediately dismounted, determined to fight it out to the bitter end. My horse fell, and as I approached him, he began to lick my hands. I then swore to kill at least one Apache. Laying down behind the body of my dying animal, I opened fire with my carbine, which, being a breech loader, enabled me to keep up a lively shooting match. This repeated fire seemed to confuse the Indians, and instead of advancing with a rush, they commenced to circle around me, firing occasional shots in my direction. They knew that I also had a 6-shooter and a saber, and seemed unwilling to try close quarters. In this way, the fight continued for over an hour, when I got a good chance at a prominent Indian and slipped a carbine ball into his breast. He must have been a man of some note, because soon after that they seemed to get away from me, and I could hear their voices growing fainter in the distance. I thought this was a good time to make tracks, and divesting myself of my spurs, I took the saddle, bridle, and blanket from my dead horse and started for camp. I have walked 8 miles since then. It is needless to add how gratified I was to receive this brave and loyal soldier again, and find him free from wound or scar. We subsequently ascertained the man he shot was no less an individual that had been celebrated Mangus, Colorado. But I regret to add the rascal survived his wounds to cause us more trouble. About an hour after Teal had come in, I was joined by Captain Roberts with 30 men, and they got a full description of the fight. I omitted to mention that 2 12-pounder mountain howitzers were with our little force, and to these guns the victory is probably attributed. It seems that about 130 or 40 miners had located themselves at Pino Alto gold mines, or the same mines mentioned in the former portion of this work as a scene where Mr. Hay and his family were attacked and their cattle stolen by the Apaches, and also where Delgadito got badly scored by Wells. This was the great stronghold of Mangus and his band, and finding himself unable to dodge the unwelcome intruders without help, he had dispatched messengers all over the principal warrior of the Apaches to assist him in expelling the miners. Mangus and some other Apache tribes united forces, amounting to nearly 700 warriors, so disposed as to take Roberts by surprise and assure his defeat. But the best laid plans of men and mice aft can be pushed aside, and these finely fixed schemes were doomed to be terribly overthrown. Roberts, entirely unexpecting of any attack, entered the pass with the ordinary precautions. He had penetrated 2/3 of the way, when from both sides of that battlement gorge a fearful rain of fire and lead was poured upon his troops within a range of from 30 to 80 yards. On either hand, the rocks afforded natural and almost unassailable defenses. Every tree concealed an armed warrior, and each warrior boasted his rifle, 6-shooter, and knife. A better armed host could scarcely be imagined. From behind every species of shelter came the angry and hissing missiles, and not a soul to be seen. Quickly, vigorously, and bravely did his men respond, but to what effect? They were expending ammunition to no purpose. Their foes were invisible. There was no way to escalade those impregnable natural fortresses. The howitzers were useless, and the men doubtful how to attack the foe. In such strait, Roberts determined to fall back, reform, and renew the contest. The orders were given and obeyed with perfect discipline. Reaching the entrance to the pass, the troops were reorganized. Skirmishes were thrown out over the hills so as to command the road. The howitzers were loaded and belched forth their shells whenever found necessary. In this manner, the troops again marched forward. Water was indispensable for the continuance of life. Unless they could reach the spring, they must perish. A march of 40 miles under Arizona's sun and over wide alkaline plains with their blinding dust and thirst-provoking effect had already been effected, and it would be impossible to march back again without serious loss of life and untold suffering, without taking into account the seeming disgrace of being defeated by 7 times their force of Apache. What would it avail those brave men to know that the Indians were as well armed as they, that they possessed all the advantages, that they outnumbered them 7 to 1, when the outside and carping world would be so ready to taunt them with defeat? Steadily forward, under a continuous and galling fire, did those gallant companies advance until they reached the old station house in the pass, about 600 yards from the spring. The house was built of stone and afforded ample shelter, but still they had no water, and 18 hours with a march of 40 miles, including 6 hours of sharp fighting, had been passed without a drop. Men and officers were faint, worn out with fatigue, want of sleep, and intense excitement. Still Roberts urged them on and led the way. His person was always most exposed, his voice ever cheering and encouraging. Immediately commanding the springs are 2 hills, both high and difficult to ascend. One is to the east, and the other overlooks from the south. On these heights the Apache had built rude but effective breastwork of piling rocks one upon the other, as so to form holes between the intersections. From these fortifications they kept up a rapid and scathing fire, which could not be returned with effect by musketry from 300 to 400 feet below. The howitzers were got into position, but one of them was so badly mangled that the gunners were brought immediately under the fire from the hill without being able to make even a decent response. In a few moments it was overturned by some accountable piece of stupidity, and the artillerists driven off by the sharp fire of the savages. At that juncture, Sergeant Mitchell, with his 6 associates of my company, made a rush to bring off the howitzer and place it in a better position. Upon reaching the guns, they determined not to turn it downhill, but up, so as to keep their fronts to the fire. While performing this gallant act, they were assailed with a storm of balls, but escaped untouched. After having righted the gun, brought it away, and placed it in a position best calculated to perform effective service. Soon as this feat had been happily accomplished, the exact range was attained, and shell after shell hurled upon the hills, bursting just when they should. The Apaches, wholly unused to such formidable engines, abandoned their rock work and fled in all directions. It was nearly night. To remain under those death-dealing heights during the night, when campfires would afford the enemy best kind of advantage, was true policy. And Captain Roberts ordered each man to take a drink from the precious and hard-earned springs and fill his canteen, after which the troops retired within the shelter afforded by the stone station, the proper guards and pickets being posted. In this fight, Roberts had 2 men killed, 3 wounded, and afterwards learned from a prominent Apache who was present in the engagement that 63 warriors were killed outright by shells, while only 3 perished from musketry. He added, "We would have done well enough if you had not fired wagons at us." The howitzers, being on wheels, were deemed a species of wagon by the Apache, wholly inexperienced in that sort of warfare. Let it be bore in mind that Captain Roberts' company of Californian infantry had marched 40 miles without food or water, had fought for 6 hours with desperation against 6 times their numbers of splendidly armed Apaches, and with every possible advantage in their favor had driven that force before them, occupied their places, taken their strongholds, and after only 1 draught of water and a hasty meal had made another march of 30 miles almost absolutely without rest. I doubt much if any record exists to show where infantry have made a march of 70 miles, fought 1 terrible battle of 6 hours' duration, and achieved a decided victory under such circumstances. Now that is some strong, battle-hardened men that lived in the mad Wild West. I hope that you liked the stories this week, and please give me a thumbs up or subscribe, and I'll keep bringing you these great stories from the mad Wild West. The Mad Wild West podcast. These are the true stories that made it wild.